The night was cold, but his tiny bare feet burned against the asphalt as he ran. He wasn't supposed to be out there alone. He wasn't supposed to run like this, chest tight, lungs burning, fear clawing at his throat. But he had no choice. If he stayed, she would die. Behind him, the house where it all happened stood silent. No one else knew. No one else cared. The world kept spinning, unaware of the horror unfolding inside those four walls. But he had seen it. He had heard her screams. He had felt her blood on his hands. And now there was only one thing left to do: find someone who would listen. Before it was too late. Night fell heavy over the small house on the outskirts of Austin, Texas. The dim streetlights cast long shadows. Through the living room windows where the sickly sweet scent of cheap perfume mingled with the sharp stench of whiskey. Inside, the old grandfather clock struck 9, each hollow chime echoing through the tense silence like a countdown to disaster. Ophelia Matthews pressed herself further into the kitchen corner, her trembling hands cradling 6-year-old Cassian against her chest. Her son's Pokemon pajamas were damp with sweat, his small body shaking as he buried his face deeper into her embrace. The bruises on her arms throbbed, but she barely noticed the pain anymore. All that mattered was keeping Cassian safe. From across the room, Celeste Blackwood watched with ice in her veins, manicured nails tapping against her crystal tumbler. The 60-year-old woman's perfectly coiffed silver hair and designer clothes stood in stark contrast to the dingy surroundings. She took a long drag from her Virginia Slim, exhaling smoke with deliberate slowness. She had it coming, Celeste drawled, her Texas accent thick with contempt. No real woman lets her house look like this. The sound of shattering glass pierced the air as Grayson hurled his empty bourbon tumbler against the wall. Bits of crystal rained down onto the worn hardwood floor, glinting like fallen stars in the dim light. "You worthless piece of garbage," he slurred, stumbling forward. His 6'2" frame cast a menacing shadow over his wife and child. The top buttons of his oil-stained work shirt were undone, revealing the "Don't Tread on Me" tattoo on his chest, a bitter irony given the current situation. Cassian's small fingers dug into his mother's target blouse as he watched his father grab a handful of Ophelia's dark curls, yanking her away from the wall. The boy's chest tightened with a familiar terror as his mother's body hit the floor with a dull thud. He wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but experience had taught him that making noise only made things worse. Instead, he bit his lower lip until he tasted blood, trying to be invisible like his mother had taught him. The sickening sound of flesh meeting flesh filled the room as Grayson's fist connected with Ophelia's face. Blood trickled from the corner of her mouth, staining the collar of her blouse crimson. She didn't cry out. She'd learned long ago that screaming only excited him more. Her green eyes, once bright with life, now held a vacant stare as she retreated deep inside herself to that quiet place where the pain couldn't reach. Celeste's laughter cut through the air like broken glass. "That's right, son. Show her what happens when she disrespects this family." She lit another cigarette, the flame from her gold lighter briefly illuminating her cruel smile. The woman, who should have been a source of protection, was instead an eager spectator to her son's brutality. Something shifted in Cassian's young mind as he watched the scene unfold. The fear that had been his constant companion since he could remember began to crystallize into something else: determination. His mother's lessons on being quiet and still warred with a new urgent thought: they needed help and no one was coming unless he did something about it. While Grayson and Celeste became engrossed in a heated argument about whose fault it was that dinner hadn't been prepared properly, Cassian saw his chance. With the careful movements of a child well-versed in avoiding attention, he edged toward the kitchen's back door. His bare feet made no sound on the linoleum floor, each step measured and deliberate. The cool metal of the door handle felt like salvation under his small palm. With one last look at his mother's crumpled form, Cassian slipped into the Texas night. The autumn air bit at his skin through his thin pajamas, but he barely noticed. His heart thundered in his chest like a trapped bird as his feet carried him down the empty street. He had no plan, no destination in mind. All he knew was that if he stayed, his mother might not survive the night. The streetlights blurred through his tears as he ran, each footfall carrying him further from the only home he'd ever known. Behind him, the sound of his father's rage faded into the distance, replaced by the whisper of wind through live oak trees and the distant howl of a lonely coyote. Somewhere in the dark, a clock struck 10, and a little boy ran for both their lives. The headlights of passing cars painted ghastly shadows on Cassian's tear-stained face as he ran barefoot down Austin's darkened streets. Each vehicle that roared past sent his heart racing, convinced that his father had finally noticed his absence and was coming for him. The boy's small feet burned against the rough asphalt, but the pain barely registered through his overwhelming fear. The familiar landmarks of his neighborhood began to fade into unknown territory. The neon sign of Jerry's Gas and Go flickered, in the distance casting an eerie red glow across the empty parking lot. A group of teenagers loitering outside the convenience store turned to stare as the small figure in Pokemon pajamas sprinted past, but no one made a move to help. In this part of town, people had learned to mind their own business. Cassian's lungs felt like they were on fire, each breath coming in ragged gasps that echoed in the quiet night. The sound of his father's angry voice still rang in his ears, mixing with memories of his mother's muffled cries. He stumbled over a crack in the sidewalk, his knees scraping against the concrete. Blood welled up from the fresh wounds, but he pushed himself back up, forcing his trembling legs to keep moving. The autumn wind whistled through the live oak trees lining the street, their twisted branches casting strange shadows that seemed to reach for him like grasping hands. A distant train whistle cut through the night, reminding him of how far he was from anything familiar. His mother had always told him never to leave their street alone, but now he had no choice. The image of her bloodied face drove him forward, even as exhaustion began to set in. Through tear-blurred vision, Cassian spotted something that made his heart leap: the illuminated sign of the Austin Police Department's 5th Precinct station. The building stood like a beacon in the darkness, its windows glowing with fluorescent light. He'd passed it countless times in his mother's beaten-up Honda Civic, never imagining he'd be running toward it in the middle of the night. His bare feet slapped against the concrete steps as he climbed them 2 at a time, desperation giving him a final burst of energy. The glass doors loomed before him, and he threw himself against them, his small hands leaving sweaty prints on the surface as he pounded frantically. Officer Sarah Harper looked up from her desk, startled by the sudden commotion. Her 15 years on the force hadn't prepared her for the sight that greeted her: a small boy in dinosaur print pajamas, barefoot and bleeding, his face streaked with tears and dirt. She quickly buzzed him in, her practiced composure masking the concern that immediately flooded her chest. "Hey there, sweetheart," Harper said softly, crouching down to meet his eye level. Her dark blue uniform rustled as she moved, the badge on her chest catching the harsh overhead lights. "Can you tell me what's wrong?" Cassian tried to speak, but only broken sobs escaped his throat. His whole body trembled as the adrenaline began to wear off, the reality of what he'd done crashing over him like a wave. What if his father found out where he'd gone? What if they didn't believe him? What if they sent him back? Harper noticed the fresh scrapes on his knees, the way he flinched when she reached toward him. Years of experience with domestic cases had taught her to recognize the signs. She kept her movements slow and deliberate as she grabbed a shock blanket from nearby, draping it gently around his shoulders. When Cassian finally managed to raise his arms, showing the dried blood from his mother that had transferred to his pajama sleeves, Harper's expression hardened. She'd seen too many cases like this end in tragedy because someone hadn't acted quickly enough. Not this time. The precinct burst into action. Officer Martinez ran to prep a squad car while Detective Johnson radioed for backup. Harper's steady voice cut through the chaos as she called it in. "Possible domestic violence in progress, child victim present. Need immediate response to..." She paused, looking back at Cassian. "Can you tell me your address, honey?" Through hitching breaths, Cassian managed to whisper their street name. Harper's heart clenched. She knew that neighborhood, knew the type of calls that came from there. Too many nights of domestic disturbances that ended in nothing because no one wanted to press charges. As they hurried Cassian to the waiting patrol car, Harper noticed him glancing fearfully over his shoulder at every sound. She helped him into the back seat, noting how small he looked against the worn leather. The boy who'd shown such incredible courage now seemed to be folding in on himself, as if trying to disappear. "You did the right thing," Harper told him firmly, meeting his terrified gaze. "You're very brave, and we're going to help your mom now. I promise." The radio crackled to life with updates from dispatch. Harper watched Cassian's face in the rearview mirror as they sped through the dark streets. Emergency lights painting the world in alternating red and blue. His small hands clutched the shock blanket tightly, knuckles white with tension. She silently prayed they weren't too late. Behind them, the police station's lights continued to burn bright against the Texas night, a reminder that sometimes salvation comes in the form of a 6-year-old's desperate run through the darkness. The front door of the Matthews residence exploded inward with a thunderous crash, splintering at its hinges as the Austin Police Department's response team burst through. The sound shattered the tense silence that had fallen over the house, replaced by the urgent shuffling of tactical boots and the sharp commands of officers securing the scene. Grayson Matthews lurched to his feet, whiskey bottle slipping from his grasp to shatter on the hardwood floor. His bloodshot eyes widened with sudden recognition as multiple flashlight beams cut through the dim room, illuminating his imposing frame. The "Don't Tread on Me" tattoo on his chest seemed to writhe in the dancing light as he swayed unsteadily, alcohol fumes rolling off him in waves. "Police! Hands where we can see them!" Officer Rodriguez's voice boomed through the small living room, his service weapon trained steadily on Grayson's chest. The other officers fanned out methodically, clearing each corner of the room with practiced precision. Their movements were swift but controlled, every step calculated to maintain control of the volatile situation. Celeste Blackwood's shrill voice pierced the air as she leaped from her armchair, her carefully maintained composure cracking like her empty wine glass on the floor. "How dare you break into my son's house?" she screeched, her designer blouse stained with spilled red wine. "Do you know who we are in this town?" Officer Harper pushed past the chaos, her eyes locked on the crumpled form lying motionless in the kitchen corner. Ophelia Matthews lay face down, on the linoleum, dark curls matted with blood, one arm twisted at an unnatural angle beneath her body. Harper's heart pounded as she knelt beside the unconscious woman, fingers pressed against her neck to find a pulse. "Get me EMTs in here now," Harper barked into her radio, relief flooding through her as she detected a faint but steady heartbeat. She carefully brushed Ophelia's hair back from her face, revealing fresh bruises blooming across her cheekbone and a split lip that was still oozing blood. Grayson's drunken laughter echoed off the walls as 2 officers moved to restrain him. "This is all just a big misunderstanding," he slurred, attempting to flash his signature car salesman smile even as cold steel handcuffs clicked around his wrists. "Me and the wife, we just had a little disagreement. You know how women can be." From his position in the patrol car outside, Cassian watched the scene unfold through the window, his small hands pressed against the glass. Every flash of emergency lights illuminated another snapshot of the nightmare he'd lived with for so long. His father being led out in handcuffs, still shouting about his rights. His grandmother trying to physically block officers from entering. The kitchen, her perfectly manicured nails clawing at their uniforms. When Celeste attempted to shove past Officer Martinez to reach Grayson, she found herself quickly restrained, her indignant screams about knowing the police chief falling on deaf ears. "You can't do this to us!" she shrieked as an officer secured her hands behind her back. "That woman deserved everything she got. She's nothing but trailer trash who trapped my son." The night air carried the sound of approaching sirens as an ambulance wailed in the distance. Cassian hugged his knees to his chest, the shock blanket still draped around his shoulders like a protective shield. He didn't feel the triumph or relief he thought he would. Instead, a hollow ache filled his chest as he watched paramedics rush into his house with a stretcher. Officer Harper emerged from the house, her uniform shirt stained with Ophelia's blood where she'd cradled the unconscious woman's head. She slid into the driver's seat of the patrol car, her eyes meeting Cassian's in the rearview mirror. "Your mom needs to go to the hospital," she said gently, noting how the boy's shoulders tensed at the words. But you did something incredible tonight, buddy. You saved her life. Cassian's lower lip trembled as he watched the paramedics carefully load his mother into the ambulance. Under the harsh emergency lights, she looked small and broken. So different from the woman who'd always tried to shield him from the worst of his father's rage. A single tear rolled down his cheek as he pressed his forehead against the cool glass of the window. "Will she be okay?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the chaos outside. The question hung heavy in the air, weighted with years of witnessed violence and suppressed fear. Harper's grip tightened on the steering wheel as she watched Grayson and Celeste being loaded into separate patrol cars, their angry voices still carrying through the night. "She will be," she promised, though her heart ached at the uncertainty in the boy's eyes. "You both will be." As the convoy of emergency vehicles pulled away from the house, Cassian caught one last glimpse of the only home he'd ever known. In the ghostly glow of the remaining police lights, it looked smaller somehow, less threatening. The monster that had lived within its walls was now in handcuffs, but the boy knew better than anyone that some monsters didn't need freedom to haunt you. The autumn wind rustled through the trees as they drove away, carrying with it the echo of a child's bravery and the first whispers of a long road to healing. The steady beep of medical monitors cut through the artificial silence of St. David's Medical Center's intensive care unit. The sterile smell of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, mingling with the artificial lavender scent from the hospital's air fresheners. In room 412, Ophelia Matthews slowly drifted back to consciousness, her eyelids fluttering against the harsh fluorescent lighting overhead. For a moment, panic seized her chest as unfamiliar surroundings came into focus. The last thing she remembered was Grayson's rage-contorted face looming over her, and then darkness. Her heart rate spiked on the monitor until her gaze fell on the small figure curled up in the chair beside her bed. Cassian was finally sleeping, his Pokemon pajamas replaced with oversized hospital scrubs that made him look even smaller than his 6 years. One of his hands still clutched hers tightly, even in sleep, while the other gripped the worn shock blanket that Officer Harper had given him. Dark circles shadowed his young eyes, testament to the trauma of the night's events. "He refused to leave your side," came a quiet voice from the doorway. Officer Sarah Harper stood there, her police uniform wrinkled from the long night, a cup of vending machine coffee cooling in her hands. The nurses tried to get him to sleep in the children's ward, but she shrugged, a small smile touching her lips. "He's quite determined when he wants to be." Ophelia tried to speak, but her throat felt like sandpaper. Harper quickly moved to help her with a cup of water, careful not to disturb the IV lines running into her arm. As the cool liquid soothed her parched throat, reality began to sink in. She was in a hospital. She was alive. And somehow her little boy had made it happen. "Your injuries are extensive," Harper said softly, settling into the chair on the other side of the bed. 3 broken ribs, a fractured wrist, severe concussion, and multiple contusions. The doctors. She paused, choosing her words carefully. "They said if you'd received many more blows to the head, you might not have survived the night." Tears welled up in Ophelia's eyes as she looked down at her sleeping son. He'd always been so careful, so quiet, doing everything he could to avoid drawing his father's attention. The thought of him running through the dark streets alone, desperate to find help, made her heart ache with both pride and guilt. "He saved you," Harper continued, her voice gentle but firm. "But now you both need to stay safe. We have Grayson and Celeste in custody, but..." She leaned forward, meeting Ophelia's gaze directly. "This isn't over. You know how these things go in small towns. They'll try to post bail. They'll have friends in high places. You need to be ready." For the first time in years, Ophelia felt something other than fear when she thought about her husband. Anger. Anger at what he'd done to her, what he'd forced their son to witness, what he'd stolen from both of them. But beneath that anger lurked familiar tendrils of terror. Where would they go? How would they survive? Their house wasn't much, but it was all they had. The morning sun began to peek through the hospital window, painting the sterile room in shades of gold. A new day was dawning, but Ophelia knew better than most that darkness could linger long after sunrise. Her whole body ached, each breath sending sharp pains through her ribcage. But it was the weight of uncertainty that pressed heaviest on her chest. "There are shelters," Harper said, as if reading her thoughts. "Programs for women and children in your situation. You don't have to go back." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a business card, placing it on the bedside table. "When you're ready to talk about options, call this number. They can help you disappear if necessary." Disappear. The word hung in the air like smoke. Ophelia had dreamed of escaping so many times over the years, but fear had always held her back. Fear of Grayson's connections in town, fear of Celeste's influence, fear of failing on her own. But now, looking at her son's peaceful, sleeping face, she knew she couldn't let that fear win anymore. A nurse entered the room quietly, checking vitals and adjusting medication levels. She offered Ophelia a sympathetic smile before leaving, her rubber-soled shoes squeaking softly on the linoleum floor. The familiar hospital routine continued around them. Shift changes, morning medications, breakfast carts squealing down hallways. But in room 412, time seemed suspended. Cassian stirred in his sleep, his small face scrunching up as if troubled by dreams. Ophelia squeezed his hand gently and he settled again, the tension leaving his features. She remembered the day he was born, how she'd promised to protect him from everything bad in the world. Instead, he'd become her protector, showing more courage in one night than she had in years. "Your son risked everything to save you," Harper said softly, standing to leave for her shift change. "Now you have to be brave enough to save yourself." She paused at the door, her expression softening. "And Ophelia? You're stronger than you think." As the door clicked shut behind the officer, Ophelia gazed out the window at the Austin skyline. Somewhere out there, a new life waited for them. But first, they had to survive the storm that was surely coming. She could already imagine Grayson's rage when he made bail, Celeste's carefully crafted lies to the police, the whispers that would spread through their small community. The morning sun climbed higher in the Texas sky, and in a hospital room above the awakening city, a mother and son slept fitfully, their hands still clasped together, two survivors on the edge of a new beginning, or perhaps another nightmare. The morning sun barely had time to warm the windows of Austin's safe haven women's shelter before the first news van pulled into the parking lot. Inside, Ophelia Matthews watched from behind thick curtains as reporters began setting up their equipment, their cameras pointed at the building like weapons. Her heart pounded against her still-healing ribs as she recognized the Channel 8 News logo, the same station where Celeste's golf partner was an executive producer. In the small room they'd been assigned, Cassian sat cross-legged on the lower bunk bed, methodically arranging the few possessions they'd been able to grab from their house. His favorite stuffed dinosaur, a worn copy of Where the Wild Things Are, and the Pokemon cards his school friend had given him. The shelter staff had provided them with basic necessities, toothbrushes, clean clothes, and a few simple toys for Cassian. But the boy seemed more interested in keeping watch over their meager belongings than playing. Breaking news from South Austin. The TV in the shelter's common room crackled to life, drawing Ophelia's attention. In a story that's capturing hearts across Texas, a 6-year-old boy becomes an unlikely hero after running barefoot through the night to save his mother from domestic abuse. Sources say young Cassian Matthews. The shelter director, Ms. Rodriguez, quickly switched off the television, but the damage was done. Other residents gathered in the common room exchanged worried glances. Publicity was the last thing any of them wanted. Their safety depended on anonymity. "Your story's gone viral," Officer Harper said softly, appearing in their doorway with a stack of newspapers. The headlines screamed across the front pages. "Child hero saves mother from brutal attack." 6-year-olds. Midnight run exposes domestic violence. Local car dealer and mother-in-law arrested in shocking abuse case. Ophelia's hands trembled as she took the newspapers, her eyes scanning the articles. They had printed everything. Their names, their address, even Cassian's school. The journalists had somehow gotten hold of their family photos, including one from last Christmas where her long-sleeved dress had hidden the bruises underneath. The stories painted Grayson as a respected businessman fallen from grace, while Celeste was described as a prominent socialite known for her charity work. "They're trying to post bail," Harper continued, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Grayson's lawyer is arguing that it was a one-time incident fueled by alcohol, and Celeste's legal team is claiming she was just trying to protect her son from false accusations." A sharp knock on the shelter's front door made everyone jump. Through the security monitor, they could see more reporters gathering, their microphones ready like vultures waiting to feast. Someone had leaked their location. "Mrs. Matthews," a voice called through the door. "We just want to hear your side of the story. The public deserves to know the truth about Grayson Matthews and his mother." Cassian pressed his hands over his ears, his small body beginning to shake. The sound of loud voices still triggered memories of those terrible nights at home. Ophelia moved quickly to sit beside him, pulling him close as Ms. Rodriguez firmly told the reporters to leave or face trespassing charges. "The DA's office is pushing for additional charges," Harper explained, sitting down on the room's single chair. "When we searched your house, we found evidence suggesting this abuse has been going on for years. Financial records show Celeste has been helping Grayson control every aspect of your life, from your bank accounts to your phone records." Ophelia nodded numbly. She had known about some of it, the way her paychecks disappeared into accounts she couldn't access, how her cell phone suddenly stopped working whenever she tried to reach out to old friends, but hearing it laid out so clinically made it all feel surreal. "The media attention is a double-edged sword," Harper continued, her expression serious. "On one hand, it's putting pressure on the DA's office to take this case seriously. People are outraged, especially about Cassian's involvement. But on the other hand," she glanced meaningfully at the window, where camera flashes occasionally lit up the parking lot. A text message alert buzzed on Ophelia's new phone, one Harper had helped her get, with a number known only to the police and shelter staff. It was from her sister in California, whom she hadn't spoken to in years after Grayson had convinced her to cut ties with her family. "Just saw the news. Oh my God, Ophelia. Why didn't you tell us? We could have helped." More messages followed. From old high school friends, former co-workers, even her estranged parents. The story had spread beyond Texas, touching hearts across the country. Everyone wanted to know how they had missed the signs, why they hadn't realized what was happening behind the Matthews' perfectly maintained facade. "Your story is becoming a symbol," Ms. Rodriguez said, returning to their room after successfully dispersing the reporters. "People are asking questions about domestic violence, about how abusers maintain their public image, about why victims don't just leave. But that doesn't mean you owe anyone your story." Cassian looked up from his dinosaur, his young face far too serious for his age. "Are they going to make Daddy and Grandma come home?" he asked quietly, the question breaking Ophelia's heart. "No, sweetheart," she promised, though fear still coiled in her stomach. She knew Grayson's resources, knew Celeste's connections. They had always found ways to maintain their control before. Outside, the media circus continued to grow. Satellite trucks lined the street, their dishes pointed skyward like mechanical flowers seeking the sun. Social media buzzed with hashtags about the case, and local domestic violence organizations reported a surge in calls from other victims seeking help. But inside their small room at Safe Haven, mother and son clung to each other, trying to find stability in a world that had suddenly turned its spotlight on their private hell. The truth was finally out. But Ophelia knew better than most that exposure didn't guarantee safety. Sometimes it only made the monsters fight harder to maintain their grip. The Travis County Jail's visiting room was cold and sterile, its gray walls decorated only by motivational posters that seemed to mock the inmates who sat there. Grayson Matthews slouched in his orange jumpsuit, the fabric unable to hide his imposing frame even as his usual swagger had dimmed under the harsh fluorescent lights. His knuckles, still bruised from that night, drummed an impatient rhythm on the metal visiting table. Through the thick plexiglass partition, Celeste Blackwood sat rigidly upright, her designer clothes looking out of place in the drab surroundings. Even after a week in custody, she'd managed to maintain her perfectly coiffed appearance. The guards whispered about how she'd convinced her lawyer to bring her favorite hair products and makeup during consultations. "The media's having a field day," Celeste hissed, her manicured nails tapping against the phone receiver she held to her ear. "Your father's business partners are pulling their investments. The country club has suspended my membership. That little brat and his pathetic mother have ruined everything we built." Grayson's eyes darkened at the mention of his son. "He was always weak," he spat, his Texas drawl thickened by anger. "Just like his mother. I tried to toughen him up, but—" He slammed, his fist against the table, making the guard by the door shift uneasily. "Lower your voice," Celeste warned, glancing at the security cameras. "Marcus says he can get the charges reduced. Temporary insanity due to alcohol, first-time offense." She waved her hand dismissively. "But we need to handle this carefully. The public loves their little hero story." The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Grayson leaned closer to the glass, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I've made some calls. Remember Jimmy from the dealership? His cousin works at the women's shelter, says they're still in Austin, probably at Safe Haven." A cruel smile twisted his lips. "And I know people who can get messages to them." Celeste's perfectly lined eyes glittered with malice. "The DA offered me a deal," she said, matching his quiet tone. "If I testify against you, they'll reduce my charges to obstruction. But we both know that's not going to happen." She pulled a folded newspaper from her designer purse, spreading it on the counter. "Look at this garbage. Brave child saves. Mother from domestic hell. They're painting us as monsters. We need to change the narrative," Grayson muttered, studying the article through the plexiglass. "Marcus says if we can make Ophelia look unstable, question her fitness as a mother." He trailed off as a guard walked past, resuming only when they were alone again. "I've still got friends at the bank. One call and her accounts are frozen. No money means no lawyer." The visiting room's clock ticked loudly in the silence that followed. Through the small window high on the wall, storm, clouds gathered over Austin, promising another Texas thunderstorm. Celeste pulled out a small notebook, her gold pen scratching against the paper as she made notes. "I've already spoken to Regina at Channel 8, she said, referring to her longtime golf partner. "She's willing to run a piece about how Ophelia's been struggling with mental health issues, suggesting she might have hurt herself that night. We can imply that Cassian was manipulated into telling that story." Grayson's face darkened at his son's name. "That little traitor," he growled. "After everything I did to make him tough." His fingers clenched around the phone receiver until his knuckles turned white. "When I get out of here, if," Celeste corrected sharply. "When you get out depends entirely on how well we play this. The media loves Cassian now, but public opinion is fickle. One suggestion of parental alienation, a few well-placed rumors about Ophelia's stability." She smiled coldly. "By the time we're done, people will be begging the courts to return that boy to his loving father." A guard announced that visiting hours were ending. Celeste gathered her belongings with practiced efficiency but paused before standing. "Oh, and I had an interesting chat with my cellmate," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Turns out her brother works as a janitor at Safe Haven. He's willing to help get a message to our dear Ophelia, just to remind her what happens to people who try to destroy this family." Through the plexiglass, mother and son exchanged knowing looks. They'd built their empire on carefully maintained appearances and brutal control, and they weren't about to let it crumble because of one night's mistakes. As Celeste rose to leave, her expensive perfume lingering in the stale prison air, Grayson felt a familiar surge of power. They might be behind bars for now, but their influence reached far beyond these walls. In the parking lot outside, thunder rolled across the darkening sky as Celeste slipped into her lawyer's waiting car. She pulled out her phone, scrolling through her extensive contact list. Judges, reporters, business owners, all the people who owed the Blackwood family favors. By the time the storm broke over Austin, sending sheets of rain against the jail's windows, the first pieces of their plan were already in motion. Inside his cell, Grayson lay on his narrow bunk, staring at the concrete ceiling. The sound of rain reminded him of that night. Ophelia's muffled cries, Cassian's bare feet on wet pavement, the sirens cutting through the darkness. But this time, the memory brought a smile to his face. Soon, they would learn what it really meant to cross him. After all, you can't run forever when you don't know who to trust. The Travis County Courthouse loomed against the morning sky, its limestone facade gleaming in the early sunlight. Inside courtroom 3B, the air was thick with tension as Marcus Whitfield, Grayson's high-priced defense attorney, approached the podium. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the polished floor as he adjusted his designer tie, every inch of him projecting the confidence that came with a $1,000 hourly rate. "Your Honor," Whitfield began, his voice smooth as honey, "my client is a respected businessman, a pillar of the Austin community. What we have here is nothing more than a regrettable domestic dispute, fueled by alcohol and miscommunication." He gestured toward Ophelia, who sat rigid in the gallery, her healing bruises partially concealed by makeup. "Mrs. Matthews has a history of emotional instability. We have concerns about her influence over the minor child." From her seat beside Officer Harper, Ophelia felt her hands begin to shake. She'd known they would try to twist things, but hearing her years of abuse dismissed as a regrettable dispute made bile rise in her throat. Cassian, sitting between them in his new dress shirt from the shelter's donation box, pressed closer to his mother's side. The district attorney, Sarah Chen, rose from her seat, her dark eyes flashing with controlled anger. "Your Honor, the defendant's attempt to minimize his actions is both predictable and despicable. We have documented evidence of long-term abuse, financial control, and systematic isolation of the victims. Furthermore, Mrs. Blackwood's involvement suggests a pattern of enabling and covering up these crimes." In the back of the courtroom, Channel 8's cameras rolled silently, their red lights blinking like warning signals. Regina Thompson, the executive, producer and Celesta's golf partner, sat with her notebook open, occasionally whispering to her reporter. The story they would air that evening was already taking shape, carefully crafted to plant seeds of doubt about Ophelia's stability. "The child's testimony is particularly concerning," Whitfield continued, his voice taking on a practiced note of concern. "A 6-year-old running through dangerous streets at night? One has to question the home environment that would lead to such behavior. Perhaps Mrs. Matthews' apparent inability to maintain a stable household." "Objection," Chen's voice cut through the courtroom like a whip. "Counsel is attempting to victim blame and introduce unfounded speculation about my client's parenting." Judge Martinez leaned forward, his weathered face showing signs of fatigue. "Mr. Whitfield, stick to the facts of the case at hand. The court is not interested in baseless attacks on the victim's character." As the legal battle continued, Ophelia noticed movement near the courtroom doors. A familiar face appeared briefly. Jimmy from Grayson's dealership, his eyes meeting hers with a knowing smirk before he disappeared into the hallway. The message was clear. They were being watched. During a brief recess, Harper pulled Ophelia aside in the courthouse bathroom. "They're playing dirty," the officer warned, checking under the stalls for listeners. "Celeste's friends at the country club are spreading rumors. They're saying you're bipolar, that you've been seeing things, that you manipulated Cassian into making false accusations." Ophelia gripped the cold porcelain sink, her knuckles turning white. In the mirror, she barely recognized herself. The confident woman she'd once been, before Grayson, seemed like a distant memory. "Will they believe it?" she whispered. "Some already do," Harper admitted grimly. "Regina's running a series called Beyond the Headlines tonight. They're interviewing Grayson's employees, neighbors who claim they never saw any signs of abuse. They're building a narrative about a troubled marriage and a vindictive wife." Back in the courtroom, Whitfield presented a motion for reduced bail, arguing that Grayson's deep community ties made him a low-flight risk. He produced character witnesses, business associates, church members, even Cassian's former teacher, all testifying to Grayson's upstanding reputation. "Mr. Matthews has already surrendered his passport," Whitfield argued smoothly. "He's willing to wear an ankle monitor, maintain a strict curfew. Surely we can find a reasonable compromise that protects everyone's interests." Chen fought back hard, presenting hospital records documenting years of suspicious injuries, bank statements showing financial abuse, and recordings of Celeste threatening shelter workers who tried to help Ophelia in the past. But with each piece of evidence, Whitfield had a counter-explanation, a way to cast doubt on the prosecution's narrative. The media circus outside the courthouse grew larger by the hour. Supporters on both sides carried signs and shouted slogans. Some praised Cassian as a hero, while others questioned how a loving father could be painted as a monster based on one drunken mistake. As the day wore on, Ophelia felt the walls closing in. Every sympathetic glance from the gallery seemed tinged with doubt. Every whispered conversation a potential threat. When Cassian needed to use the bathroom, she was afraid to let him go alone, remembering Jimmy's knowing smile. The hearing concluded with Judge Martinez taking the bail motion under advisement. As they left the courthouse under Harper's protective escort, Ophelia caught sight of a newspaper headline, "Troubled Mother or Victim? New Questions Emerge in Matthew's Case." In the car ride back to the shelter, Cassian's small voice broke the heavy silence. "Mom, why are they saying those things about you? They're not true." His eyes, too old for his young face, searched hers in the rearview mirror. Ophelia swallowed hard, remembering all the times Grayson had made her doubt her own reality, how Celeste had expertly twisted every situation to make her look unstable. Now they were doing it again, but on a much larger scale. "Because sometimes, honey," she said softly, "telling the truth makes powerful people angry, but we have to keep telling it anyway." As they pulled into the shelter's secure parking garage, Harper's phone buzzed with a news alert. Celeste had been released on bail, her influential friends having pooled their resources to meet the bond. The message was clear. The game was far from over, and the Matthews women were playing against opponents who knew how to manipulate not just the legal system, but public opinion itself. The pre-dawn quiet of Safe Haven Shelter was shattered by a mother's desperate scream. Ophelia Matthews burst from her room, her bare feet slapping against the cold linoleum as she raced down the hallway. The bottom bunk where Cassian should have been sleeping was empty, the dinosaur sheets still warm but missing their small occupant. "Cassian!" Her voice echoed through the shelter's corridors, drawing other residents from their rooms. Ms. Rodriguez emerged from her office, still wearing yesterday's clothes from working late. The shelter director's face drained of color as she took in the scene. The open window that should have been locked, the small scuff marks on the wall beneath it, and most tellingly, the playing card left on Cassian's pillow. A King of Hearts, Grayson's favorite poker card. Officer Harper arrived within minutes, the flash of her cruiser's lights painting the shelter walls in alternating red and blue. She found Ophelia crumpled on the floor of Cassian's room, clutching his stuffed dinosaur to her chest. The morning sun was just beginning to creep through the window, illuminating the tears streaming down her face. "The security cameras," Harper barked at the shelter staff, already pulling out her phone to call for backup. "I need the footage now." But even as she said it, she knew what they would find. The system had been professionally disabled sometime during the night. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The shelter erupted into controlled chaos as police officers swept the building. Every room, every closet, every possible hiding place was searched. Outside, K9 units began working the perimeter, their German shepherds sniffing the ground where fresh tire tracks marked the parking lot's gravel. "This was planned," Harper said grimly, studying the window. "Professional job. The alarm system was bypassed, the cameras looped old footage." She turned to Ophelia, whose hands wouldn't stop shaking. "Think carefully. Did anything seem off yesterday? Any unusual visitors, phone calls, anything?" Ophelia's mind raced through the previous day's events, trying to focus through her panic. The court hearing, the media circus, Jimmy's smirking face in the courthouse hallway. "The janitor," she whispered suddenly. "There was a new janitor last night. I'd never seen him before, but he was wearing the regular uniform." Harper's radio crackled to life with updates from her team. No signs of forced entry except the window. No witnesses. The night staff had been drugged. Someone had brought in donuts during the evening shift. Everything pointed to an inside job, meticulously planned and executed. The morning news was already breaking the story. Regina Thompson's voice filled the shelter's common room from the TV. Breaking news from Austin, 6-year-old Cassian Matthews, who made headlines last month for his brave escape to save his mother, has reportedly gone missing from Safe Haven Women's Shelter. Sources close to the family suggest this may be another cry for attention from the troubled household. Ophelia lunged for the TV, but Harper caught her arm. "That's what they want," the officer said firmly. "They're trying to provoke you, make you look unstable. We need to stay focused." At that moment, Ophelia's phone buzzed with an unknown number. Her hands trembled as she answered, putting it on speaker at Harper's signal. A digitally altered voice filled the room. "If you want to see your son again, drop the charges. All of them. You have 24 hours to make a public statement recanting your accusations." The line went dead, leaving behind a silence so heavy it seemed to press against their eardrums. Harper immediately began coordinating with her tech team to trace the call, but Ophelia barely heard her. All she could think about was Cassian. Was he scared? Was he hurt? Was he calling for her? Ms. Rodriguez appeared with a cup of tea and a tablet showing local traffic camera footage. "We're pulling everything we can," she said gently. "All the shelters in Texas are on alert. They won't get far with him." But Ophelia knew better. This wasn't some amateur kidnapping. This was Grayson's work, planned with Celeste's precision and executed with their seemingly endless resources. They had connections everywhere, friends in high places, and most importantly, they knew how to make things look legitimate. The hours crawled by like years. Each passing minute was another moment Cassian was in danger, another moment she wasn't, there to protect him. The shelter filled with police, FBI agents, and media crews camping outside the gates. Through it all, Ophelia sat on Cassian's bed, holding his dinosaur and remembering how brave he'd been that night he ran for help. Now, it was her turn to be brave for him. "Mrs. Matthews," an FBI agent approached carefully, tablet in hand. "We need to discuss your options. If you make the statement they want, we might be able to set up a controlled drop." "No," Harper interrupted firmly. "The moment she recants, she loses all credibility. They'll paint her as mentally unstable, claim she made everything up. She'll lose Cassian forever." The truth of those words hit Ophelia like a physical blow. This wasn't just about getting Cassian back. It was about keeping him safe forever. If she gave in now, Grayson would win and the cycle would continue. Her son would grow up learning that violence wins, that money can buy justice, that the truth doesn't matter if you have enough power to bury it. As the sun climbed higher in the Texas sky, casting long shadows through the shelter windows, Ophelia made her decision. Standing up, she faced the gathered law enforcement officers, her voice stronger than she felt. "I want to make a statement," she said, "but not the one they're expecting." The lights of the Channel 8 studio blazed overhead as Ophelia Matthews sat in the interview chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to hide their trembling. Regina Thompson, perfectly coiffed and professionally sympathetic, leaned forward with practiced concern. The red light on the camera blinked on, signaling they were live across Texas. "Mrs. Matthews," Regina began, her voice honey-sweet but eyes sharp as razors. "You've requested this interview to make a statement about your previous accusations against your husband, Grayson Matthews, and his mother, Celeste Blackwood. Would you like to tell us what's changed?" Behind the cameras, Officer Harper stood with her arms crossed, surrounded by a team of FBI agents monitoring every feed, every signal, every potential communication channel. They had wired Ophelia with a hidden microphone, but everyone knew the real message would come through other channels. Ophelia took a deep breath, looking directly into the camera. "Yes, I would." Her voice was steady, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "I want to speak directly to the people who took my son." Regina's perfectly plucked eyebrows rose slightly. This wasn't the script she'd been expecting. In the control room, phones began ringing as Celeste's lawyers scrambled to cut the feed, but it was too late. "You think you've won?" Ophelia continued, her voice growing stronger. "You think that by taking my child you can force me back into silence. But what you don't understand is that Cassian taught me something the night he ran barefoot through the dark to save us both. Courage isn't about being fearless. It's about being terrified and acting anyway." The studio fell completely silent. Even Regina, usually quick with a redirect, seemed momentarily stunned by the raw emotion in Ophelia's voice. So yes, I have a statement to make. To every person who helped plan this kidnapping, every person who looked the other way, every person who chose to protect the powerful instead of the innocent, we see you. The police have been tracking every call, every text, every suspicious bank transaction. And right now they're closing in on where you're keeping my son. In the production booth, chaos erupted as multiple monitors lit up with breaking news alerts. FBI raids were happening simultaneously across Austin, at Grayson's dealership, at Celeste's country club, at the offices of their closest associates. Mrs. Matthews. Regina attempted to interrupt, her professional mask slipping slightly. Perhaps we should take a break. No. Ophelia cut her off firmly. No more breaks, no more silence. You wanted me to recant? Instead, I'm going to tell every detail you tried to hide. About the offshore accounts where you hide the abuse payoff money. About the other women who were silenced before me. About every person in this city who helped maintain your facade of respectability, while knowing exactly what happened behind closed doors. The studio doors burst open as FBI agents entered, heading straight for the control room. Regina's face had gone pale, her hands shaking slightly as she realized her own complicity was about to be exposed. Ophelia's phone buzzed in her pocket, the signal she'd been waiting for. Harper's team had traced the kidnapper's location to an abandoned warehouse owned by one of Grayson's shell companies. They were moving in now. So here's my real statement. Ophelia continued, tears finally breaking through her composure. To my son, who's probably watching this somewhere right now, you were so brave that night, baby. Now it's Mommy's turn to be brave for you. And to everyone who thought they could break us. Her voice hardened. You have no idea what a mother will do to protect her child. The studio erupted into chaos as federal agents began making arrests. Regina was led away in handcuffs, her designer blazer clashing with the steel bracelets around her wrists. But Ophelia barely noticed. Her eyes were fixed on the message that had just appeared on her phone. We have him. He's safe. 20 minutes later, she burst through the doors of Austin Presbyterian Hospital's emergency room, Harper right behind her. And there, sitting on an examination table with a child life specialist, was Cassian. His Pokemon pajamas were dirty and his eyes were tired, but he was alive. He was safe. Mommy, he cried out, launching himself into her arms. Ophelia caught him, holding him so tight she could feel his heart beating against hers. I knew you'd find me, he whispered into her hair. I knew you wouldn't let them win. Harper approached quietly, her face showing both relief and grim satisfaction. We got them all, she said softly. The kidnappers rolled over on Grayson and Celeste as soon as we breached the warehouse. They have texts, emails, payment records, everything. No one's walking away from this one. As the adrenaline began to fade, Ophelia sank into a nearby chair, still clutching Cassian to her chest. Outside the hospital windows, the sun was setting over Austin, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. It was the same sun that had risen the morning Cassian ran for help. The same sun that had witnessed their darkest moments and now, finally, their triumph. What happens now? Cassian asked quietly, his small hand finding hers. Ophelia kissed his forehead, breathing in his familiar scent. Now, she said, we get to be free. The Travis County Courthouse buzzed with anticipation, its marble halls filled to capacity with reporters, advocates, and spectators. The morning sun streamed through the high windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden benches of courtroom 3B. Today wasn't just another hearing. It was the day justice would finally be served. Grayson Matthews sat at the defendant's table, his orange jumpsuit a stark contrast to the polished mahogany surroundings. Gone was the confident swagger of the successful car dealer, replaced by dark circles under his eyes and a nervous tick in his jaw. Next to him, Celeste Blackwood maintained her rigid posture, but her designer outfit couldn't hide the defeat etched in her face. District Attorney Sarah Chen approached the podium, her heels clicking against the floor with purposeful determination. The evidence boxes stacked behind her told their own story. thousands of pages documenting years of abuse, financial fraud, and corruption. But it was the videos playing on the courtroom screens that held everyone's attention. Security footage from the warehouse showed the kidnappers receiving instructions via video call from Celeste. Email chains revealed Grayson's elaborate plans to discredit Ophelia. Bank records exposed a network of payoffs to silence previous victims. With each new piece of evidence, the carefully constructed facade of the Matthews-Blackwood dynasty crumbled further. "Your Honor," Chen began, her voice clear and unwavering. "The state has presented irrefutable evidence of not just domestic violence, but a systematic campaign of abuse, intimidation, and corruption spanning decades. The attempted kidnapping of Cassian Matthews was not an isolated incident. It was the desperate act of powerful people who believed they were above the law." From her seat in the gallery, Ophelia held Cassian's hand tightly. The boy sat straight-backed, in his new suit, watching the proceedings with solemn understanding. Officer Harper sat on his other side, her presence a steady reminder of how far they'd come from that terrifying night. The prosecution called witness after witness. Former employees testified about Grayson's violent outbursts at the dealership. Country club staff recounted Celeste's threats and blackmail. Most damaging were the other victims, women who had finally found the courage to come forward, each story adding another brick to the wall of evidence. When it was Grayson's turn to speak, he attempted one last performance. "Your Honor," he began, his voice cracking with well-practiced emotion, "I'm a flawed man who made mistakes, but everything I did was out of love for my family." "Objection!" Chen's voice cut through his act like a knife. "The defendant's attempt to characterize systematic abuse and kidnapping as love is both offensive and contradicted by the evidence." Judge Martinez nodded grimly. "Sustained." The single word echoed through the courtroom like a death knell for Grayson's chances. As the day wore on, the true extent of the Matthews-Blackwood corruption emerged. The kidnapping had unraveled a web of criminal activities: tax evasion, money laundering, witness tampering. Regina Thompson and several other conspirators had already pleaded guilty, turning state's evidence in exchange for reduced sentences. Finally, after hours of testimony and deliberation, Judge Martinez cleared his throat. The courtroom fell silent as he prepared to announce the sentences. Ophelia pulled Cassian closer, both of them holding their breath. "Grayson Matthews," the judge began, his voice heavy with authority, "this court sentences you to 25 years in federal prison without possibility of parole." He turned his stern gaze to Celeste. "Mrs. Blackwood, for your role in these crimes, you are sentenced to 15 years. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as Grayson's face contorted with rage. "You can't do this to me," he shouted, struggling against the bailiffs who moved to restrain him. "I'll appeal. I'll remove the defendant," Judge Martinez ordered sharply. As Grayson was led away, still shouting threats, Celeste remained eerily silent, her perfectly manicured nails digging into her palms until they drew blood. Outside the courthouse, the Texas sun blazed overhead as reporters clamored for statements. Ophelia stood at the microphone, Cassian brave and steady beside her. "Today isn't about revenge," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the crowd. "It's about truth. It's about showing other victims that they don't have to stay silent. That justice is possible no matter how powerful your abuser might be." Officer Harper watched from the sidelines, a small smile playing at her lips. She remembered the terrified little boy who had run into her precinct that night, and the broken woman she'd found on the kitchen floor. Now they stood tall, survivors rather than victims, their story already inspiring others to speak out. As they walked down the courthouse steps, Cassian tugged at his mother's hand. "Are they really gone?" he asked quietly. "Forever?" Ophelia knelt down to his level, brushing a stray lock of hair from his face. "Yes, baby. They can't hurt us anymore." She pulled him into a tight hug, feeling the strength in his small frame, the same strength that had given him the courage to run through the dark and change both their lives forever. The afternoon light caught the tears in her eyes, making them shine like diamonds as she held her son close. Behind them, the courthouse stood as a testament to justice served, while before them stretched a future finally free from fear. They had faced their monsters in the light of day, and they had won. 6 months after the trial, Austin's spring warmth filled the air as Ophelia Matthews stood in front of her new apartment's mirror, adjusting her name tag. Ophelia Matthews, domestic violence counselor, glinted under the morning light streaming through the windows. The woman who looked back at her barely resembled the broken soul who had once hidden bruises under long sleeves and carefully applied makeup. The small 2-bedroom apartment in South Austin wasn't fancy, but it was theirs. Bright artwork, Cassian's creations from his art therapy sessions, covered the walls. A certificate from Safe Haven's counselor training program hung proudly next to his latest school achievement award. Signs of healing and new beginnings filled every corner. In the kitchen, Cassian sat at the breakfast table, his Spider-Man backpack ready for school. He was different too. The fearful silence had been replaced by a 7-year-old's natural chatter, his eyes bright as he told his mother about the presentation he was giving in class today. "It's about heroes," he explained, milk dribbling down his chin as he finished his cereal. "But I'm not talking about Superman or Batman. I'm talking about real heroes, like the kids at the shelter who helped their moms escape, like Officer Harper. Like you, Mom." Ophelia's heart swelled as she wiped his face with a napkin. The past months had been a journey of recovery for both of them. Twice-weekly therapy sessions, support group meetings, and the unwavering support of their newfound family at Safe Haven had helped them rebuild their lives piece by piece. The morning routine that had once been filled with dread was now a peaceful dance. Breakfast together, checking homework, making sure shoes were tied properly. Simple things that felt like miracles after years of walking on eggshells. As they headed down to the parking lot, Mrs. Rodriguez from Safe Haven pulled up in her old Toyota. She had become Cassian's regular ride to school since Ophelia started working at the shelter's outreach program. The older woman's warm smile and steady presence had been a cornerstone of their recovery. "Big day today?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked, helping Cassian load his backpack into the car. "Mom's speaking at the conference," he announced proudly. "She's going to help other people tell their stories." The Domestic Violence Awareness Conference at the Austin Convention Center had become one of the largest in Texas, partly due to the attention their case had brought to the issue. Ophelia's story had sparked a movement, inspiring others to come forward and seek help. Later that morning, Ophelia stood backstage at the convention center, her hand smoothing down her navy blazer, a gift from Officer Harper, who had become much more than just the cop who helped them escape. Through the curtain, she could hear the murmur of hundreds of voices waiting to hear her speak. "You ready?" Harper appeared beside her, now wearing a detective's badge after her promotion. The officer's unwavering support had shown Ophelia what true friendship looked like. The audience fell silent as Ophelia took the stage. Faces looked up at her. Survivors, advocates, law enforcement officers, and most importantly, people still trapped in situations like the one she had escaped. Her voice shook slightly as she began, but grew stronger with each word. "6 months ago, I stood in a courtroom and watched justice being served. But that wasn't the end of our story, it was just the beginning." She paused, looking out at the sea of faces. The hardest part of abuse isn't just surviving the violence. It's rebuilding yourself afterward, remembering who you were before someone tried to break you. In the front row, Cassian sat between Mrs. Rodriguez and Harper, beaming up at his mother. His therapist had said that seeing her strength would be crucial to his own healing, and moments like this proved it. "My son taught me the most important lesson about courage," Ophelia continued, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. "It's not about being fearless. It's about being terrified and taking action anyway. He showed me that when he ran through the dark to save us both. And he shows me every day as we build our new life." The rest of her speech flowed naturally. Statistics about domestic violence, resources for victims, the importance of community support. But it was the personal moments that held the audience spellbound. The first night they slept without fear, Cassian's first genuine laugh in their new home. The day she realized she could look in the mirror without flinching. After the conference, they drove to their favorite diner, the one where they'd celebrated after the trial. The waitress, Maria, knew their order by heart: chocolate chip pancakes for Cassian, even though it was dinner time, and a grilled cheese with extra pickles for Ophelia. "Miss Sarah called today," Cassian said between bites, referring to his school counselor. "She wants me to talk to some other kids whose parents." He trailed off, but Ophelia understood. "How do you feel about that, honey?" He considered the question seriously, pushing his pancakes around with his fork. "I want to help them not be scared anymore. Like how you helped the ladies at the shelter." Ophelia reached across the table, squeezing his small hand. Their journey of healing was far from over. There were still nightmares, still moments when a loud noise would make them jump, still days when the weight of their past felt overwhelming. But they were facing it together, growing stronger with each small victory. Outside the diner window, the Austin sunset painted the sky in shades of hope. They had done more than just survive. They had found their voice, their strength, their purpose. And somewhere in the city, another victim was gathering the courage to break free, inspired by the story of a brave little boy who ran through the darkness to find the light. The pearl-white envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, bearing a return address from one of Austin's most prestigious law firms. Ophelia stood in her apartment's small kitchen, turning it over in her hands as steam rose from her forgotten coffee cup. The handwriting was elegant, old-fashioned, the kind that spoke of private schools and fountain pens. The letter inside was written on heavy cream-colored stationery, embossed with the name Richard Blackwood at the top. Ophelia's hands trembled as she recognized Grayson's father's name, the man who had remained mysteriously absent throughout their entire ordeal. "Dear Mrs. Matthews," the letter began, the ink slightly smudged as if written by an unsteady hand. "By the time you read this, I will likely have passed away. Terminal cancer has a way of forcing one to face the truths we've spent a lifetime avoiding." Ophelia sank into a kitchen chair, her eyes moving across the carefully penned words that followed. Richard Blackwood's confession spilled across 3 pages, detailing a legacy of violence that stretched back generations. He described his own father's brutality, how he had learned to associate love with control, and how he had systematically broken his son's spirit through years of calculated abuse. "Celeste wasn't always the monster she became," he wrote. "When I married her, she was young, idealistic, filled with dreams of changing the world. But I taught her that power was the only protection from pain. I watched as she transformed into someone who would rather inflict suffering than risk experiencing it herself. Together, we molded Grayson into the weapon we thought we needed him to be." Outside, the morning traffic hummed along South Congress Avenue, but in Ophelia's kitchen, time seemed to stand still. She read about the network of enablers Richard had cultivated, the judges he'd bought, the victims he'd silenced. Each word painted a picture of calculated cruelty passed down like a poisoned inheritance. "Your son broke the cycle," the letter continued. "When I saw the news coverage of his midnight run, I recognized something in his eyes that I had spent a lifetime trying to destroy in Grayson. Raw, unfettered humanity. The courage to feel fear and act anyway. The strength to choose love over power." Attached to the letter was a cashier's check for $1 million, along with documentation transferring ownership of several properties into a trust for Cassian's education. But it was the final paragraphs that brought tears to Ophelia's eyes. "Money cannot undo the damage my family has caused. It cannot erase the scars, visible and invisible, that you and your son will carry. But perhaps it can help build something new from the ashes of what we destroyed. The trust comes with no strings, no conditions, no control. Everything I never gave my own son." Cassian found her still sitting there when he came out for breakfast, his Spider-Man pajamas rumpled from sleep. "Mom, are you okay?" Ophelia quickly wiped her eyes, managing a smile. "Yes, baby. Just reading something important." She watched as he poured his cereal, his movements confident and unguarded in their safe space. "Hey, Cass, what would you think about starting a foundation to help other kids and moms like us?" His face lit up with interest. "Could we make it so kids don't have to be scared to sleep at night, so they don't have to learn to be really quiet or hide their toys?" "Yeah, honey. Exactly like that." She reached for her phone, texting Harper to come over after her shift. They would need help setting everything up properly, ensuring the money would do the most good. Later that evening, as Cassian worked on his homework at the kitchen table, Ophelia sat down to write her response to Richard's letter. She described how Cassian was thriving in therapy, how he had started a peer support group at his school, how his nightmares were becoming less frequent. She told him about the shelter's expansion plans, the new programs they were developing, the lives they were helping to rebuild. "Your letter asked for forgiveness," she wrote, "but that's not mine to give. What I can offer instead is a promise. Your family's legacy will not end with the pain it caused. We will transform it into something healing, something hopeful. The money you've provided will help ensure that other children won't have to run through the dark to find safety, because we'll help them build that safety in the light." As she sealed the envelope, a familiar tune drifted from Cassian's room. He was humming while getting ready for bed, something he'd never dared to do in their old house. The sound brought fresh tears to her eyes, but these were different from the ones she'd shed reading Richard's letter. These were tears of gratitude, of wonder at how far they'd come, of hope for the future they were building. Through the window, the Austin skyline glittered against the night sky. Somewhere in those lights, other families were living through their own dark nights, fighting their own battles for survival. But tomorrow, Ophelia and Cassian would start working on their foundation, turning their tragedy into triumph, their pain into purpose, their scars into strength. The cycle of violence that had shaped 3 generations of the Blackwood family had finally been broken by the courage of a 6-year-old boy who dared to run into the night. And now, that same courage would light the way for others to find their own paths to freedom.